Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well. We are live here this morning on Facebook talking all about FII. Um, the full term is fabricated or induced illness. I'm joined this morning by the amazing Cathie Long and Dr. Fiona Gullon Scott, and we're going to be going into quite a lot of detail about what FII is, what FII isn't, because that's very important, and also understanding more about the research and practice as well for professionals, whilst also answering your questions. So if this is something that is affecting you at the moment, or perhaps you know somebody who it's affecting, please do watch this video and by all means submit your questions. I need to remind you, though, this is a public Facebook page, and so please don't give any information away that's going to put you at risk. If you have any questions that are private, just send them to us privately on the Facebook page. So I will crack on because this is our first big event of FII Awareness Week. So we've got plenty lined up for you this week. Let me scroll on. So we are Sunshine Support, for those who don't know. I know there'll be lots of people watching this morning who are interested in learning more about FII, but actually have never heard of Sunshine Support. So just a few ground rules before we start. This is an interactive workshop in the fact that you can submit questions and comments on the chat. Like I say, please feel free to do that. Do tag anybody who you feel might find this useful. You'll be able to watch it again. So if you're coming in a little bit later to this Facebook Live this morning, you'll be able to watch it again on our Facebook page straight away after we've finished. So don't worry, there'll be plenty of information on hand now and later on. We're going to be here for up to 2 hours this morning. It depends how fatigued we get by the subject. Please, we do ask you, don't verbally attack or name any professionals because it will get you in trouble and it's not very nice for the professional. I know that emotions will be running high as you listen to this webinar this morning. The emotions run high for us as speakers as well, but it's really important that we don't incriminate anyone or land ourselves in trouble. And if you do want to learn more about FII, and this really does pique your interest in learning more, then we have a whole week of webinars that you can sign up to. There is the link. By all means, if you need it sending to you again, just comment and we'll send it to you. So just a very brief intro to Sunshine Support. We're almost 7 years old now, and we were founded upon my traumatic experience, which included accusations or false accusations of FII, and which is how I met Cathie, because Cathie is my God and she saved my family, which is why it's so important really that we're having these conversations now, because it wasn't really spoken about, and that was only 7 years ago. But now I'm joined by loads of different SEND professionals at Sunshine Support who are professionals in their own right, but nearly all of them as well have the lived experience. We're an award-winning SEND organisation. So SEND stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, and we cover the UK, but our training actually reaches quite far overseas as well. And we support parents, carers, and professionals who also support children and young people with SEND. And we've got a very wide range of services. I'm not going to read them all out. By all means, have a look at our website, but we can do a wide variety of things to be able to help you, validate you, empower you, and make you feel stronger for the journey ahead, despite whether you're a parent or a professional. So if you need us, get in touch, or by all means, ping us a message. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can see faces. So that's good. Morning, ladies. It's lovely to have you on this morning.
Thank you. Morning.
We're going to be going to be covering quite a lot today, aren't we? And it's going to be quite emotional. So I think, I mean, I've got the tissues ready because I know that you know what I'm like. I end up like having a little dab because I find it quite emotive and stressful and re-traumatizing. So to everybody watching, do lots of self-care because this information is important, but it's also important to look after yourselves. So I'm going to pass over to you now. We've heard enough of my voice, and we will learn more about FII.
But I guess, Fiona, we probably need to introduce ourselves,
Yeah.
don't we?
I think we should, Cathie, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Cathie Long. I'm an independent social worker, and I do, I'm an expert witness for special educational needs and disability tribunals. I do lots of different things as an independent social worker, and a high portion of my work is working with families where parents or a parent has been accused of fabricated or induced illness. And over the last probably 4-5 years, I've noticed a really big increase in the number of people contacting me about FII or concerned about FII. And I met Fiona probably about 2020, when we started working together to put to write the practice guide for social workers, which is published by the British Association of Social Workers on FII. So we had a team of experts together, and really put our hearts and souls into writing that. And so it's out there, and we can put a link in the chat for people to access that later. Because it will explain a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And currently we're really proactively working with a sort of a network of different professionals, legal professionals, etc., across the UK to really try and change the face of FII. I believe that what's happening is very akin to, or very similar to, the post office scandal, which took 20 years to come out, and yet it was there and awful things were happening. And I'd say the same is happening now. And as I say this, I feel quite emotional about it, to be honest. It's very difficult. So yeah, I'm going to pass over to you before I cry.
Thank you, Cathie. So I'm Fiona Gullon Scott. I'm a clinical psychologist, and as you can see, I work at Newcastle University as well, where I am on the clinical psychology doctoral programme. I'm one of the tutors on that programme. I'm also involved with, recently involved with something up here in Newcastle called Insights Northeast, which is a way in which Newcastle University liaises with policymakers to try and kind of share between I guess practice and policy in the real world with informed by evidence-based and research, and I'm one of their associates, particularly around the sort of field of FII. As Cathie says, we've been working over the last few years really hard to try and make change. So my journey into FII started probably a little bit longer ago than yours, Cathie, I'm not sure, but I was doing expert witness work, which I don't do now for a lot of different reasons, but it was probably about a decade or so ago, and I was asked to do assessments of parents who had autistic children, and the parents had been accused of FII, and I went along to meet the families and thought, well, this is a neurodivergent parent, undiagnosed, and these cases kept happening. I kept getting asked to see these families and going, hang on, this is another neurodivergent parent that's been accused of, oh, there's another neurodivergent parent who's been accused of FII. And I started to wonder what on earth was going on. And frustratingly, in some of those cases, it was a bit of a lottery, to be honest. So in some cases, being able to say this parent is neurodivergent, this is not what you think is happening, this is not FII, it's just different parenting, meant that the case got dropped. And then in other parts of the country, saying that made no difference at all. And in fact, what would happen is people go, oh, if this parent's autistic, well, if they're autistic, then they can't have empathy, and all of those sorts of misunderstandings. And then you'd end up with, it was almost like the local authority would try and take it down a different rabbit hole. So yes, that's one of the many reasons why I don't do the expert witness work now, because it got exceptionally traumatic for me as a professional. So, and that's nothing compared to what the families were going through. But it was also because I made the decision, particularly after meeting Cathie and Luke Clements and Andy Bilson and other people who are working in this sort of area, that my effort might be better placed to try and work in a sort of policy way and to change for many people rather than working one-on-one with families. Not that I don't want to work one-on-one with families, but I have a lot of different hats to wear and a lot of things to do. So I'm actively researching in the field. I have a little team now of clinical psychology trainee students who are all at various different levels of doing research around the impact of FII. So because I'm a psychologist, we're focusing very much on the trauma to the parents, the trauma to the children, the way in which FII is understood or misunderstood, the impact that that has, how people get sucked into that system, what's going on, in order to be able to try and change that, and to change that with an evidence base. So that's, I guess, where I sit now, is trying to work at that sort of policy level, practice level, trying to really make a change alongside Cathie and Luke and various other colleagues. And I was delighted when Cathie asked me to be involved in writing the BASWA guidance, and it's really nice to hear that that guidance actually is really well received and is being used quite widely. So that's the first kind of little step, I guess, that came out of this, you know. And then there's the paper that we wrote, Cathie, that's probably one of the few that's out there, just kind of, I guess, initially challenging the construct. And I suppose, to put things from my perspective, to put things in perspective, I do get quite professionally angry, but I also try and keep my science head on and be objective as well. And so I guess I want to make it clear that whilst in the one hand, I'm very driven by supporting and representing families, particularly neurodivergent families. That's my kind of area for the last 30 years, has been autism and ADHD and neurodivergence. I'm very driven to support and help and improve understanding and awareness around neurodivergence, and kind of, I guess, challenge discrimination, and challenge kind of erroneous beliefs, like the whole, oh, you know, autistic can't have empathy thing. That's just a lot of nonsense. And to do that through a research medium. But the fact that I want to challenge FII as a construct doesn't mean that we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say this never happens. But it's to raise the issue, and this is what we'll be talking about this morning. It's to raise the issue that the FII as it currently exists as a construct is not very well defined, and whether it intends to or not, is scooping up ever such a lot of differently abled families, and massively overrepresented by differently abled families who are not doing anything wrong, but are falling foul of a badly defined construct and a system that doesn't understand the difference in parenting and sees that difference as being frightening or wrong or damaging. So that's the kind of angle that we're coming from, that you'll hear us talking about this morning. It's trying to just kind of get that balance back as it should be, really.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we spoke before we came on about, you know, certain individuals and professionals who really push this FII, you know, and widen that net and catch too many families within it. And they talk so much about, oh, but the children. But on the flip side of that, oh, but the children, those children are actually being scooped up and traumatized in a way they wouldn't have been before. But also, we are hearing in the news all the time about the failed children, the ones that should be picked up by social care, the ones who aren't being safeguarded, you know, and we hear some, oh, awful, I'm not going to go into detail, but the awful stories, the fatalities that happen to these children who are being missed because resources are being misused on the families that don't need them, which is this wide net that's scooping them all up. And we know that that trauma is far-reaching. We know that it goes into adulthood. I know for my family, it's destroyed my family, even though we were only on that accusation and child protection plan for 3 months. This is far-reaching. This is 7, 8 years on, and it still plagues my entire family and wider family, and it's destroyed the family. And so, you know, which is why, from a parental point of view, I am here to sort of say, well, I wasn't the one you should have been looking at. I was scooped up in that net. I'm neurodivergent. I have too much empathy, not enough empathy. And I think that, and I know this comes out a lot in the conversations that we have, but if you're as a parent going to professionals and saying, I need help with my child, there's something going wrong and I'm not quite understanding what's going wrong. When they fail to understand what you're reporting, you take it upon yourself to do the research, and that obviously puts you in a bit of a category that you know too much. And I think that's a neurodivergent thing as well. So again, scooping up too many families, I think when we look at it like that net, I think it's a very good analogy. So so I will let you share your screen then, Cathie, and we will get on. And for those watching, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the comments, so we will be coming to your comments and your questions throughout. The PowerPoint that we're sharing is very much a talking point, and so we're not going to be sort of making you fall asleep by PowerPoint.
Yeah.
They're just talking points.
Yeah, that's fine, Chris, because we're very happy to stop the slideshow and answer questions and have discussions about things, but there is some information that we really want to get across to people. And we will put the link for the practice guide on
Yeah.
later, and a lot of this information will be in there, might be slightly differently written, but it will be there. So the first thing is, what is fabricated or induced illness? And this is what the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health Guide, their guidance says. It's a perplexing presentation. So it's when a child or young person is presented with a medical condition that's not understood, and it's an alerting sign to possible fabricated or induced illness. That can be a really vast number of conditions. So it doesn't just relate to neurodivergence like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc. It can be things like PANS and PANDAS, which is a sort of infection which causes unusual behaviours. It can be hypermobility syndrome, it can be chronic fatigue syndrome, it can be physical conditions as well. That's other physical conditions, quite serious. So that's what a perplexing presentation is, when it's not necessarily understood. And concerningly, it might be a medical condition that if a parent went to one medical practitioner, they would have knowledge about that condition, and another might have no knowledge about that condition. So there's differences between different professional experiences. It's FII is described by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health as a clinical situation in which a child is, or very likely to be, harmed due to parent's behaviour and action, carried out in order to convince doctors that the child's state of physical and or mental health and neurodevelopment is impaired, or more impaired than it actually is. So they're sort of suspected of either making up a condition for their own gain or exaggerating a condition for some kind of gain. And that's actually what the sort of Royal College guidance says.
Yeah, and just to come in on that, Cathie, I mean, I think from my perspective as a scientist, I'm a clinical scientist, I'm a researcher. Just looking at that quote from the RCPCH raises so many flags for me in terms of thinking about this objectively. So they're talking about a clinical situation in which a child is or very likely to be harmed. So firstly, you're going, well, how do you know that? How are you working out if a child is likely to be harmed by a parent? So you're kind of predicting in advance that something that a parent is doing. And unless you've got a parent sort of, I don't know, hovering over a child with a syringe, or you can physically see them putting salt into their food, what quite a lot of this often a lot of the FII cases, certainly I've worked with, have been under the guise of emotional abuse. So it's like the argument that the parent is doing something that's somehow going to be damaging to the child in an emotional or psychological sense. So the first thing there is that, how do you know if a behavior is likely? Who's deciding that the behavior is harmful? Then you've got the bit that says carried out in order to convince doctors that the child, okay, so who's deciding that that's why the parent's doing it? Because that's getting to parental intention. And yet actually when you read the guidance in full, the RCPCH will argue that they're not interested in the motivation of the parent. They're not psychiatrists or psychologists. They're looking only at the child. So how can it on the one hand in the guidance say, this is the intention of the parent, effectively. This is the parent is doing this to convince doctors that the child's state of physical and mental health or neurodevelopmental is impaired. So they're telling us that this is the intent of the parent. And then on the other hand go, oh, but we're not bothered about why the parent's doing it. We're only bothered about the impact on the child. That is contradictory to me. Because what we've got here is a sentence that for me smacks wholly of opinion, subjectivity, and very much around somebody deciding a person's psychological motivation, psychiatric motivation, whatever. And then you can also see that that included within that is neurodevelopment. And we know that when you look at the guidance at the moment from the RCPCH, it literally states autism and neurodivergent presentations as being potential indicators of possible FII. So there's quite a lot just in that one phrase that is difficult to kind of accept objectively when you're looking at that from a science perspective.
And Fiona, I mean, sort of from a scientific perspective as well, is that, you know, parents accused of FII, and a massive percentage are mothers and women. But there's no psychological assessment that happens. So if somebody had, you know, we'll come on to this a bit later, but if somebody had other sort of supposed psychiatric conditions, there would be a really, really robust assessment of their psychological profile, looking at risk, looking at the sort of clinical history, past, present, and what might happen in the future. And that's how to do a very, very good analysis. It doesn't happen. So many parents accused of FII are accused, and how do they challenge that? You know, which we'll come on to later, but it's really difficult.
Can I just add in there as well, when we did our research last year, we found that actually almost 40% of the false accusations that sort of took part in our research were actually instigated by teachers. So again, this sort of saying that you're trying to convince doctors, actually there was no doctors involved. And in quite a lot of the cases that we deal with, there are no doctors involved, but the parents are still being labelled with this FII, whether it's formal FII or they're describing it in a different way. And the professionals we have involved are not medical professionals. They tend to be teachers and unqualified social workers, actually, you know, where you've got the early help-based sort of social workers. So again, it seems to be that nobody seems to have a defined description that they're working to. They just have this idea that's been given to them, and it's like, oh yeah, that sounds about right. Let's just give them that, and we'll start with these proceedings.
Yeah. And as soon as FII is raised, whoever it is that raises it, it instantly becomes, because of the way our system works, it instantly becomes a child protection issue, and then it gets taken over by child protection. It goes down that route, and that is also part of the problem, is that this isn't raised as a possibility, and then someone goes, oh, hang on a second, as you say, Priscilla, you guys are educational, you know, you don't have the qualifications to make this decisions. Let's get some relevant practitioners in who are expert in this area. That doesn't happen. It just goes, oh, someone said the word, now the local authority is going to put it down child protection route. And then and then it just snowballs. I've often, Cathie will know this, I often liken it to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I mean, it's basically as soon as you've gone in that door, that's it. You're viewed through that lens. That sort of starts to escalate, and you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And it's very difficult to get out of that. It's very difficult to get off that sort of wheel, so to speak. And that's one of the other big problems that we have around this. So a lot of what Cathie and I, are involved in and we'll talk about, it's partly the problem with the way that this is defined. But beyond that, it's the way that that's then picked up and interpreted and employed within the systems that we currently have, whether they're local authority systems, child protection systems, whatever. It's the system is wrong. And this is the description as it stands of FII within that isn't helpful within that system.
Yeah, I think, what I was thinking as well is that I know that a lot of the referrals to social care, high percentage, are from education. And I believe that's because a child who will mask in school can hold it together in school, and at home, that's why a child will let everything out, and the parents are saying, well, we can't cope. And the school's saying, well, they're fine in school, so you've got to be making it up. So, and this has happened over and over and over again. So I think it is about lack of training, lack of understanding. I also believe that most often, not always, that professionals are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to protect a child, and but it's clearly not working. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Okay, really important this, because this sort of can be very confusing or confused. Is FII is not a diagnosis. It is a set of criteria professionals use to establish when a parent might be creating or exaggerating their child's difficulties, with no clear evidence to support their claims. And this is what I really sort of get very, very frustrated, upset, disturbed about, is that somebody can suggest FII, and as Fiona's just said, everything from that point, everything is looked at through an FII lens. They just have to suspect it with no clear evidence to say that the parent is actually harming the child or exaggerating or making up their child's condition. Professionals often confuse FII with factitious disorder imposed on another, which is an extremely rare psychiatric condition. And it used to be known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And I did a webinar last week with Autistic Parents UK, and somebody said, came on the chat and said, well, I was accused of all three all in one go. So there's clearly still confusion. Mm-hmm. And the last time I looked on the NHS England website, it says FII is the new name for Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It's not. I did email them about it, but they haven't ever come back to me. So, yeah, it's not a diagnosis. And because it's not a diagnosis, parents aren't having that psychological assessment.
Yeah, I think that's one of the frustrating things, isn't it, from our perspective, Cathie, is that it's used as if it's a diagnosis, and professionals will sometimes talk about diagnosing the mum with FII, and it isn't a diagnosis. And in fact, even more frustratingly, the formal diagnosis, the factitious disorder imposed on another, which does exist as a psychiatric diagnosis in the diagnostic manuals, that one excludes all sorts of things, which would effectively mean that a neurodivergent parent wouldn't be likely to be diagnosed with FDIOA. So it's actually very difficult to get diagnosed with factitious disorder imposed on another, because you have to rule out all the other reasons for what's being observed. So if you have a parent who's autistic, or if you have a parent who's got other difficulties or presentations going on, that means that you can go, oh, this is why this behavior is happening, or this is why mum's coming back to see the GPs all the time, or this is why, this is occurring within the family. That actually negates it. The other thing about FDIOA, the actual diagnosis, is that there has to be the intention to deceive. And you'd have to prove that the parent intended to deceive. But with FII, there's no need, that it actually excludes, as it says here, you don't have to intend to deceive. There's no concern about that. It says, doesn't matter what the parent's reason for doing this is, or reason for behaving is. And there's no exclusion. There's no kind of, oh, well, if we can explain the behavior some other way, then it's not FII. That doesn't happen either. So the argument is that FII, by not, it's become too inclusive, because it's saying it's not a diagnosis, it's a set of behaviors, and we can just randomly apply that set of behaviors to anyone that we feel fits, and no other explanation can counter that. Whereas at least when you've got a diagnosis like factitious disorder imposed on another, you can say, does this person meet the criteria, yes or no? And then you can move forward. But there's so many ways that you can meet the criteria for FII, because it's so badly defined, it's so vague, it's so broadly defined.
Fiona, I think as well, factitious disorder imposed on another, the guidance says in terms of diagnosing that it should be a multi-professional team, so it shouldn't just be a quick sort of outpatient consultation with a psychiatrist. It's a very robust assessment process, which people accused of FII aren't having.
Yeah, absolutely.
So FII, it's considered a form of emotional and physical abuse, so it could be emotional or physical abuse, and is thought to lead to neglect. In genuine cases of FII, which isn't a diagnosis, the caregiver will truly believe their perception of their child's difficulties with no intention of deception. So that's different to factitious disorder imposed on another. And then at the other end of the spectrum, caregivers will deliberately induce symptoms in their child. And that sort of falls more in line with factitious disorder imposed on another, and what was known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And so it will be giving a child substances that might be harmful to them to make them unwell. And that is very, very rare. And yes, there will be parents that do things that are harmful to their children. And Fiona and I aren't here to say that FII or an equivalent isn't real. However, far too many families are caught up in the FII system, and what we would like to see is that there's much more robust, clearly defined guidance, so that the families and children that need the support really, really get it, and that all children are protected, because that's ultimately what we're about. So these are some of the criteria for FII from the Royal College of Paediatrics. I'm sure Fiona needs to step in as you need to. But so frequent and invasive medical investigations. And I would add into that this is interpreted as, if a parent wants to apply for an education, health and care plan for their child, the best way to get that, although that should not be based upon diagnosis, most of the system often requires a diagnosis, so parents will be advised, okay, you need a educational psychology assessment, you need a speech and language therapy assessment, might need occupational therapy assessment, might need an independent social worker or a physiotherapy assessment. So having those types of assessments to support an education, health and care plan could be viewed as frequent and invasive medical investigations. That's point one. And lots of parents accused of FII are parents applying for an education, health and care plan. Unnecessary treatments. And that can be very vast, and it could be somebody choosing that for their own reasons for their child to have, a gluten-free or casein-free diet, and other factors. There's much more to it than that, and I'm not going to go into what would constitute unnecessary treatments. Missed education and social isolation. It's huge. I mean, I know Sunshine Support have done a lot of work about you know, children not being school refusers. Children and young people can't go to school. It get to a point where it's impossible for them to go to school. And yet, if a child or young person can't go to school and they're at home, then that ticks this box. And limited in daily life and the adoption of a sick role or lifestyle as a disabled person. So, you know, a child sort of taking on board what the parent is asserting. And the characterisation as being disabled through the receipt of disability benefits or special education provision. So the ulterior motive of the parent here about saying their child has a disability is that they want to get benefits or special educational provision. There will be parents that do this. I think it'll be very rare. And the child becoming anxious or confused about their state of health and abilities. And I think that will happen, because if they're in a family situation where a parent or parents are accused of FII and the family are not receiving the right support, I think that's a very, very difficult place for a child to be as well. And this is the further research, Fiona, that you're looking at, aren't you? The trauma that it is caused to children, what they experience during the child protection process in relation to FII and afterwards. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, looking at these criteria, you can see again the subjectivity that sits around this in terms of who is deciding that the medical investigation that a family has or a child has received are frequent or invasive, who's deciding they're unnecessary, who's saying that the missed education and social isolation is either wrong or inappropriate or, you know, not relevant, and it goes on. I mean, I know of families where there are experiences around Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, for example, or chronic fatigue, and you know that within those families you're going to have days when physically you're more able and you're going to have days when you're less able, and the wrong kind of professional or a professional who doesn't have a good understanding of that, looking at that, might kind of go, oh, well, hang on a minute, you know, you didn't need the wheelchair yesterday and you do today, so you're making it up. And you can see how a lack of understanding about how genuine complex conditions present would lead some professionals, particularly kind of non-health professionals, to look at that through the lens of someone being sort of deceitful or trying to play the system or something along those lines, instead of actually understanding what that really is presenting. And that's quite a few of the cases that I've worked with. It's that kind of thing going on. It's people kind of not understanding the presentation of the parent or the child and viewing it through a completely different, quite, you know, subjective perspective based on their professional training rather than the appropriate professional training to understand perspective based on their
So how common is FII? I think we will sort of there's been quite a lot of work in time with subject access requests to find out how many local authorities, the records about FII, and yet they don't necessarily sort of keep statistics of FII, so it's very difficult to know how common parents being accused of FII is, but actually how common is FII. I think, you know, like what was Munchausen syndrome by proxy or factitious disorder imposed on another, it's very, very rare. It's not the common thing. So there's no epidemiology for FII, but we do have statistics about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which are very low. There's, I think it's something like, is it 2 or 3%, Fiona?
Yeah.
And then Well, yeah, I've
Not
got
a
it
lot
there.
less than that, actually. I mean, 2.8 in 100,000 is quite a lot less than 2 or 3%. You know,
I
it's
missed that bit. I didn't
0.0.
notice that.
Yeah, yeah, it's like 0.02%. Yeah.
So if we took this is a few years ago when we wrote these figures, but if there were around 12,540,000 children under 16 in the UK, there could be between 50 and 351 true cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Yeah.
That's very, very low. So, you know, the bottom line being 50, which is probably more accurate, might be less than that. But so it's a very, very rare condition. And yet, Fiona, I mean, you know, your team are meeting lots and lots and lots of families. It's sort
Oh
of,
goodness, yeah. I mean, if you look at the numbers of families who've been investigated for FII, you're in the thousands and tens of thousands. So that's an awful lot of people being questioned or considered as possible FII cases when the actual literature that's referenced in the RCPCH guidance would lead to these kinds of figures. I mean, it's the RCPCH less than 2 or 3% that says
I didn't notice that.
the kind of 0.4 to 2.8 in 100,000 kind of MSBP rates. So, you know, extrapolating that's what gives you the 50 to 351 cases. So the RCPCH literature is what gives us those numbers. And yet the actual number of investigations is, you know, tens of thousands, certainly thousands, but I think tens of thousands from some of the research that Luke's been doing. Huge numbers.
And what I do know, Chris, you said it earlier, and it's a common experience that even if somebody's just very short term caught up in the child protection system, or you know, long term and children are removed, the trauma is immense, and it does affect. It doesn't go away. I mean, the trauma might change, and it might be more sort of tolerable or manageable. However, it's there, and it will shape the rest of that person's life in terms of things like going for medical appointments, you know, maybe not complaining about the school, because if I complain about them again or get annoyed, they're gonna report me. It's those sorts of things. And so the amount of anxiety and fear that parents experience when they've been accused of FII is huge. And the mistrust of services, the you know, not believing that if I ask for help I will get it. So it's the consequences are huge because far too many families are being accused of FII.
And I think as well, I know that you're probably going to cover this, but I know that I took one of my daughters to a routine eye appointment at the hospital many, many years after the whole child protection thing for us. And this particular child of mine had never been on child protection, yet on the front of her medical file, it said this family is subject to child protection proceedings. But that documentation would have been 5 years old. And there was no way that I could ask that clinician at that time to remove that from the front of a file because number one, it shouldn't have been on there. Number two, it was old. But this clinician said, that's not my job. I'm not information. You have to go through, you know, data protection and that sort of thing. And I think as well, when you're dealing with neurodivergent families, what you well, any family really, what you don't want to do is throw that cast of sort of doubt into the mind, because I know for my child, the minute a social worker said, well, maybe you're not all the things that the doctors are saying that you are, and that then just created such an enormous identity crisis for her that she continues now to battle with, is this something my mum purchased for me? Or is it genuine? Because that's what was put into her head by social workers. And, you know, like I say, we are 7 or 8 years on. That doubt is still very much embedded, but also, you know, as neurodivergent people, we experience rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD, which, you know, by all means, people Google. But it's this sort of extreme paranoia. So then you start to have a lot of self-doubt yourself. Is this me? I don't know. And like you said, the ongoing, if I go into school to talk about why a reading book needs to be changed, am I going to be sent to social care? Because you have this unbelievable paranoia that any communication that you have with a professional is going to end in something quite awful. So it is very far reaching.
Yeah, thank you. So to recap, factitious disorder imposed on another does exist, but it's rare and it requires the intent to deceive, and it requires no other explanation for the behaviour. So it actually excludes anxious parenting. So a parent being anxious about their child does not constitute factitious disorder imposed on another or FII. And this is taken from you, Fiona. Care must be taken to balance desire to find true positive cases against the risk of high numbers of false positive cases and the damage that wrongful FII accusations brings to families.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that we're trying to make is, as we said, we're not saying that there are no cases of FII, but what often happens is that the sort of hunting or looking for those potential true cases is done obviously with the intent to protect children. And if FII investigations were completely devoid of any damage, if they didn't hurt people to do them, then we probably wouldn't be quite so upset about the way that it's currently presented. If you could go through an FII investigation and come out the other end without any trauma to the family whatsoever, then we'd be going, oh, you know, crack on then, it's not causing a problem. But that's not the case, and that's not being recognised, I think, by the professionals or the systems that are putting families through these investigations. There's no acknowledgement of how incredibly damaging and traumatizing it is. I mean, Chris has been talking about this, but we know that it causes huge levels of trauma. We know that it destroys families. We know that it leads to some of the experiences that Chris was talking about there. We know that once FII is on your notes somewhere, it's incredibly difficult to get that removed. And then that trauma, even if you've actually gone through a process where somebody's gone, do you know what, this isn't FII, and you're not doing anything like that within the family, because that sits on your record, you can move house or go to another area or go and see another professional, and up it pops again, and then you're looked at through the same lens, even though it's been disproven. And I know of families where they've been pulled back into exactly the same system multiple times by different sets of professionals, just because on their records it's been mentioned, so it gets looked at again and again and again. So the damage is huge, and that's what we're trying to work on, is getting the balance right, so that we're not causing trauma to families, including the children. You know, it's not that, you know, the children are absolutely traumatized by the experience, not just the parents. We're not causing trauma to families in an attempt to find those relatively small number of families where the parent is intending to erroneously present the child as ill.
Yeah. So FII, it's just reinforces what Fiona's just said, but it argues equifinality, the belief that taking a child from multiple health investigations is inherently emotionally abusive, and that the reason why a parent does so is not relevant. So why is the parent taking the child for these assessments? You know, rather than they're taking their child for lots of different assessments, so it's got to be FII. And then it also, again, it comes back to, well, if a parent is accused of FII because they've taken their child for multiple assessments, then they're going to avoid going for assessments. And so that, you know, and that can lead to other issues as well if they need to happen. And FII lacks clarity. It has no evidence base. It's poorly defined and actively includes anxious and concerned parents. It is not a diagnosis. I would use that as a summary of FII. You know, it lacks clarity. it's not supported by evidence or research. It is poorly defined because it invites too many people into the FII arena, and it actively includes anxious and concerned parents. Most parents would be anxious and concerned about a child. They can't go to school, or they're saying they're not well and the parent knows there's something going on. That's really important, and it's not a diagnosis. Fiona, I know you have lots of the research that's going on. So these are what I know about. So just feel free to add to what I say. So this is from recent research, and that there has been a lot going on, and I'm delighted about it. Disabled parents of disabled children are 4 times more likely to be accused of FII than non-disabled parents. So that's by the University of Leeds, their research, Clements and Aiello. Autistic parents have described how their diagnosis was considered as a perplexing condition, with all aspects of their being pathologized, examined, unpicked, and analysed by baffled outsiders. And so this is research by Cathie, and she looked at autistic parents' experiences of social care. And I know, and I've heard this from social workers, that a parent being autistic is automatically flags up a risk. It's just awful. Neurodivergent parents are more likely to be accused of FII, which is Alice Running and Danielle Yotta Hall. That's their research. Disabled children and their families within the UK are one of the most severely disadvantaged groups. Families with disabled children often experience a system which is set up for child protection, not support. And that's the Cerebra research in 2021, which Luke and Anna were involved in. And it really is that when a parent requests a social care assessment, which should be under Section 17 of the Children Act for a disabled child, they end up being assessed as if they're under child protection. And so, it's more of a safeguarding approach rather than looking at, okay, this is what this family needs, we need to support them. Okay, Fiona, do you want to add to the research?
I guess only to say that there's ongoing research happening throughout, and so I've got I can't remember if I mentioned it at the start or not, but a little team of clinical psychology trainees who are all kind of working in areas around looking at the trauma, the sort of psychology side, I guess, the psychosocial and psycho-emotional sides and impacts of this, both for the parents but also for the children. So I've got one of my trainees coming through who's going to be listening to the children's voices because they haven't been heard yet. There's a lot of research around the parents. Obviously, very carefully, we're going to do this as very carefully and ethically as we can do, touching on subjects like this for children. But I guess what we want to be able to do is say, okay, here is the evidence of the trauma of being investigated at FII, not just to the parents, but also to the children. And, maybe I'm an objective scientist. I have to not go into it with an agenda. Maybe we will talk to these parents and we'll talk to the children, and out the other end of the research will be, no, not traumatizing at all. It's been absolutely fine. I don't suspect that on the basis of all of the people I've talked to and all of the research that's on this page. So I'm not really expecting that to be the case. But the other reason that we're doing this is it's not just to sort of score points against the RCPCH. It's because we're, as psychologists, something that I'm interested in is looking at the support system. How do we On the one hand, how do we inform policy change and system change in a way that is trauma informed? We work very actively as a trauma informed practice within clinical psychology to be aware of people's traumatic experiences and being very open and transparent and collaborative in working with families. And that's definitely not the approach in your typical child protection arena. So trying to use our skill set, I guess, to inform change to the systems and the way that people work with families. And to look at interventions and support for these families as well, because something that's very clear is that we have all of these families who are going through this and experiencing horrific kind of traumatic impacts from it, and at the end not getting offered anything. I don't know of any parents where a local authority at the end of saying, you know, going through this investigation, and particularly when you at the end of it you sort of decide, or the decision is no, this isn't FII. All that family gets is the sort of shrug of the shoulders from the local authority, and well, oh, sorry. There's no offer of support, there's no therapy, there's no how do we kind of help this family process this horrific experience that they've had. It's just a sort of shrug of the shoulders and no accountability whatsoever. So we're really keen to take what research we're doing to look at the best way to support families as well. So we've got quite a lot of sort of psychological research that's going on. I guess the only other one that's out there that I would think is worth, you know, people might be interested in looking at is the work that Peter Baker had published a little while ago. It wasn't specific to FII, it was around looking at disabled families kind of more broadly in terms of interprofessional experiences. But that was one of the earlier projects that I saw where, although they were trying, the study was looking broadly at the experience of disabled families in the social care system and health systems and systems generally, what sang out of that were so many quotes of families going FII, 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 FII. And the fact that was rearing its head. And that perhaps was one of the ones that kind of kick-started some of these others that then really specifically started looking, you know, FII as a construct more closely. So I think it's great that there's a lot of research happening around this. What's really interesting, and you know, if there's anyone out there who works in pediatrics who's in pediatrics or the RCPCH or within that side of the systems, firstly, welcome, glad you're here. We really need to talk to you guys. But if there is anyone out there, I would really like to know of the research that's happening from that side, because I'm not personally aware of any research currently ongoing from pediatrics or the RCPCH or any around that to actually look at the evidence base for FII. Because, you know, as we've said earlier, as far as we can tell in the literature that we've read, there isn't any. There's a lot of theory, there's a lot of models, there's lots of hypotheses, and there's lots of referencing back to MSBP, Munchausen syndrome by proxy data, but there's no actual research evidence around FII as a construct. And that's something that right from the outset we were saying, you kind of need this. You can't develop a construct without evidence base behind it, or at least you shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a construct without an evidence base behind it. So I just would genuinely be interested if there is any, because I'm not aware of any that's coming from the other side that's helping to kind of look at what FII is and you know, if there is evidence for it as it's currently presented.
Thank you, Fiona. I think you know, you talking about your team, Fiona, looking at trauma to parents, to the children, is really, really important, because when a parent or a family go through accusations of FII, and I'm working with families where they've had children removed from their care, and then at some point all the allegations are dropped or quashed, and then the child's returned. Then there's still there's an amazing amount of trauma, and yet there's no psychological therapeutic work provided to the families to help them heal. And so unless they have the means, and I know, Chrissy, you've had to do this with your family, is to access private sort of therapists, counsellors, etc. You know, there isn't, it's just families are left to get on with it, and that's so hard. And it's not something, as I said earlier, that people can just recover from just like that. It leaves very deep wounds.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, like you say, I've privately funded therapy for all of us in the family. And one of my children, she is she's now with a very, very highly specialist trauma therapist who does somatic body experiencing work. So it's all looking at the physical impact. And my word, there's a huge amount of physical impact. And like I say, we are 7 or 8 years on, and she's only 12. You know, you sort of think about the immense impact on her, and the amount of people who they assume that she's, number one, older than she is, because she's had to grow up so quickly to deal with the stuff that she's dealt with as a little girl, even with the protection of us. And that has its own problems as well, because everybody assumes she's probably 5 or 6 years older than she actually is. But also the amount of people who assume that she has certain neurodivergences, but it's actually trauma. So then it starts a new cycle. You know, is mum saying that she's neurodivergent? Oh, are we going down that route again? I didn't say a thing, you know, and we've got to be really, really careful. And I think one of the things as well Fiona's touched upon is the dropping off the edge of the cliff. You know, the fact that, oh, okay, you don't have FII. I remember this in my own case, Cathie, that child protection review that you came to and you gave your evidence, and they went, oh, so the major thing we missed the first time was the diagnosis of autism. Right, sorry about that. You shouldn't have had to go through the last 3 months. Let's take you off child protection. It was as simple as that. However, there was then no support. So what we'd gone to them for to start with was support. Can somebody please help? They've then turned an assessment into an investigation, put us on child protection, then realized they got it all wrong and went, okay, no worries, goodbye, yeah, good luck, see you later. And we're like, well, hang on a minute, where was the support? Because that's what we came to you for. And we see a lot of families like that where they're reaching out. And let's be fair, the amount of strength and courage it takes to reach out and say, I don't know whether I've got what it takes to parent my child. I'm really, really struggling. I don't understand their presentation. I don't understand how to keep them safe. I don't understand how to support their mental health. Please, can someone help? That takes such enormous strength and courage to be able to come forward and admit that, and to be met with that wall of, that's a very perplexing way of approaching us. Let's do a Section 47 investigation. I like to call it investigation assessment, or something that feels much more invasive than the standard assessment, which is the Section 17. And I know that we've got a webinar later in the week with Rachel Gavin, and she's going to be talking about how we assess as social workers, because of course, Cathie, she's one of your very close colleagues. She's an independent social worker. She's going to be talking about how we actually assess neurodivergent families, because I think that is feeding, this is a very strong theme coming through this morning, the neurodivergence. But yeah, so many things that we've got to talk about and further discuss. And it's very, very interesting how it's very one-sided, this research. It's this side that we're seeing here, but there's not a lot more than a very strong voice, the other side. There's no research, no recent research.
And I think, Chris, sorry, so, you know, leading on from what you're talking about, a parent saying, I can't manage, I can't cope, I'm exhausted, I haven't had sleep, etc., 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 and then getting very upset. The number of times I've worked with parents where they've been, because they've got upset, okay, the problem's got to be mum's mental health, you know, and it's really a common experience that, so whatever is said, if a parent sits there and says nothing, or, you know, doesn't speak up, then they'll be allowed to get on with it. And if they say this is how it really is, then okay, it's down to mum's mental health. And that's not always mum, but it primarily is. So yeah, it's a really difficult situation. And I mean, anything I say, it's not about all social workers or all
No.
professionals, but this has been an experience that I've witnessed, in my professional capacity.
Yeah, it's really sad. I think you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Because if you don't speak up, you're seen as neglectful and you're not advocating for your child. If you speak up, you're seen as antagonistic, or what did they call me? Manipulative. um, and it's quite upsetting. And one of the things I always say to parents in my webinars is, if you'd saved up for a very nice car or you won the lottery and a local authority worker came and whipped that car away in front of your eyes and stole it, or stole all the money out of your bank, everybody would say that you were justified in getting very angry and upset. Yet our children, who are worth more than any posh car or any lottery win, we have to sit back and allow them to neglect and actually emotionally abuse. A lot of the emotional abuse that I know that we experienced was not me to my child, it was the system to us as a family. And I have to sit back as a parent and allow that to happen and not speak up for us. I think that it's absolutely crazy in the world that we're in now, where money speaks louder than actual human emotion and connection. I think it's really sad. And one of the comments actually this morning on the chat, I've been keeping an eye, and they said it feels very much to this particular person that they're moving a financial problem from one department to another. So I know that's how it felt to us. So we were going for an EHCP, which would have been an education fund. And they've gone, oh, hang on a minute, there's talk here of the parent perhaps exaggerating. Let's push it over to social care. That will delay the EHCP. That saves us a bit more money. Plus, it'll be social care's problem. And I remember a social worker saying to me, if we were to remove your child and put them into foster care, it would cost us between 50 and 60K. But if we were to follow the trajectory of what your professionals are saying that your child needs through education, it would be more in the region of 250,000. Do the maths. That's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But money, sadly, money talks, doesn't it?
And there is a lack of funds, education, social care, and health. We're all sort of witnessing the struggles, and so it just adds another level to what's happening, or another motive. And I'm not at all implying or trying to say that people are accused of FII just to save budgets, but there might be that unconscious bias.
Yeah. And of course, we're only going on, specific experiences. And every local authority behaves differently. They all call it something different. The way that they fund things are differently. So, yeah.
This checklist comes from the British Association of Social Workers Practice Guide that Fiona and I wrote with our colleagues, and they're questions to consider. We're suggesting that social workers, because they're the lead agency in child protection and safeguarding, consider these. So, does the child have an existing diagnosis? So, is there a diagnosis? And is there reliable evidence to support their diagnosis? And sometimes there has been, well, they've had a private diagnosis, therefore they've bought the diagnosis. It's not an NHS doctor, so it's not valid. And yet so many people, I'm an independent social worker. I used to work for a local authority. So many professionals, doctors, psychologists, etc., will work for the NHS at some point and then choose to come out for different reasons. So, that's it's questioned. If there's a private diagnosis, it's questioned.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't mean to jump in on you there, Cathie. I was just going to say,
that's okay.
I was going to say, of course, that's currently also exacerbated by the fact that the wait lists, particularly post-COVID, but even before that, the waiting lists are horrific to actually get an NHS assessment, whether it's for the child or the parent. I mean, I know up here, someone was telling me the other week that the adult services for ADHD and autism, their wait list is up to 5 years now. So if you were a parent seeking diagnosis for the NHS, you'd got to wait 5 years. And the children's services are still, 2 to 4 years. So it's not surprising that families go to private practitioners to try, they're desperately trying to get that support. And you're absolutely right. So we should really challenge this concept that something private is not quite as good, because it's usually the polar opposite. People who are working in private practice have more time to give to those assessments and usually have a vast amount of NHS experience as well. And so that assumption that a family has bought a diagnosis is very, very rarely true. So
I agree there. So another question is, do parents or siblings, because we know things can be, well, they are genetic, have a diagnosed physical, neurological or psychological condition that needs to be considered? Are there disputes between medical professionals about a child's diagnosis? We in the British Association of Social Workers Practice Guide, we sort of relate this to chronic fatigue syndrome, because not that long ago, chronic fatigue syndrome, I remember this growing up, was described as yuppie flu. There was sort of, and then there was for a long time, up until a couple of years ago, the prescribed treatment for chronic fatigue syndrome was graded cognitive behaviour therapy, graded exercise approach. And now it's been shown that this doesn't work because they didn't listen to the people with chronic fatigue syndrome or ME. So there can be medical disputes about different conditions, and there can be, doctors have different areas of expertise and they might not know anything about one condition compared to another, and yet can sort of assert, okay, this parent's making it up. And it's the power of professionals really to sort of, and so often people listen to the doctor. So if a doctor's saying something, saying this is a diagnosis, this parent has FII, it will be listened to. And I think, yes, it does need to be listened to, but actually, medics can be challenged. And is there an interprofessional dispute about the existence of the child's reported condition, which is what I've just covered?
It's interesting you were saying there, Cathie, about medics can be challenged, but of course, another alerting sign in the RCPCH FII guidance is if somebody goes to ask a second opinion. If you challenge a medic, or if you go and seek another opinion because you actually don't agree with the one that you've got, that's another nail in the coffin in terms of FII. And it goes back to what you were saying, Chrissa, around you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. It's so, you're not allowed to disagree with the doctor.
No, there's a huge power imbalance around all of this in terms of who holds the power, and it's not the parents, and that needs to change.
Yeah. And I think that also from a social care perspective, as a social worker, I mean, I'm an approved mental health professional, and I did so that means I can assess people under the Mental Health Act. And so when I did my training, which was many years ago, the whole part of that was to hold my own, to question, to challenge doctors, and to sort of give equal, diffuse the power so that somebody's not detained in hospital unnecessarily if there's an alternative that's going to work better for them. And so that's very much my training, and so many social workers don't feel able to do that for whatever reason. And so, if the doctor says this, we have to take it seriously. Yes, we do, but actually we also need to walk the middle road, listen to what they're saying, but also think there could be another side to this that we haven't looked at, and sort of explore it. So I have covered this, but does the child present differently in school, college compared to at home? So child could be in school masking and just being very compliant, and at home but most of us we can be our worst at home and we have to go off to work or college and sort of perform. So is that one factor? Has the parent made a complaint against the referring agency organisation? The research that's happened, I know the Cerebral research, I think it's the Cerebral research, showed that a lot of parents have made a complaint and then are accused of FII. And I'm not saying it's the counter-attack necessarily. They dared to complain, so we're going to stitch them up and refer them to social care. But there is a complaint, and as a consequence, a referral is made to social care. And also, has the parent previously made complaints against the local authority? So if they're asking for help from a local authority, disabled child asking for a Section 17 assessment under the Children Act, they don't get a very good assessment, or something doesn't go according to plan, a complaint's made, and rather than think, okay, maybe we haven't got this right, then that, okay, this parent's persisting, they've got to be, they're making their child difficulties up, and it's a whole sort of scenario happens. Is the parent seeking a child to have an education, health and care plan, or are they appealing the existing one? So that can be a factor. And this is really important. If the parents of a child are separated, is there a disagreement about the child's presentation and diagnosis? So this can be parents separating. One parent believes my child's autistic or my child has some condition, and the other parent thinks, no, I don't see it. And so that's where the doubt about, or the doubt about what the parent's saying can start. If, the parent saying my child needs help, we need help. And I've had experiences where the local authority have ended up colluding with the absent parent. So if the father's moved out, they say, okay, dad's right, mum's, exaggerating. And it's a really, really difficult situation. One of my colleagues who has been involved in this as a clinical psychologist will, when she's asked to assess a child, whether they're autistic, ADHD or neurodivergent, will insist that both parents are present for that assessment, so that that they are sharing the same insights, knowledge, information, to try and counteract that from happening.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
So, and then for families where there have been concerns about FII, the interactions between them and children's social care have often compounded their sense of feeling victimised and disempowered. That's so true. Many parents accused of FII report their experiences of engaging with social care as undignified and traumatic. And yes, it is. And the aim of social work practice, the aim of any professional working with children and young people, is to protect children from the risk of harm. However, the social workers sought to protect and promote the well-being of the child or young person. There have been cases where the focus has been on a parent's historical mental health issues and a lack of parental boundaries, rather than considering the bigger picture. This is it leads on to the next point, that they're following a neurotypical approach to parenting and quickly dismissing alternative parenting styles. And autistic parents very often will parent differently. It's not less than the other approach, it's different and it works. And yet that's so often criticised, the way that they approach their parenting. And historical mental health issues, and it's something I could do a whole session on, is particularly if a autistic parent has been misdiagnosed with a borderline or emotionally unstable personality disorder in the past, which is a really, really stigmatizing diagnosis for many, many reasons. That can become the focus. And I've seen this a lot of times where social workers particularly have ignored the fact that a parent is autistic and focused on they've got a personality disorder. and that can be really, really harmful. And therefore, the autistic mothers, all their behaviour is looked at through the lens of a personality disorder rather than because they are autistic. Fiona, is there anything you want to say at this point?
I don't think so, Cathie. I mean, I think you've covered it quite well there. I guess just to comment that, you know, one of the difficulties around some of these aspects, like the parenting, for example, is that there aren't many, if any, parent assessments that have been specifically developed to map onto anything other than neurotypical parenting. So when you do have kind of social workers, for example, going in and doing parenting assessments, I mean, there's one or two parenting assessments that I'm aware of that have been developed that are for families where there are disabled family members, but nothing specific to autism that I know of. So, you know, you end up with someone kind of walking into an environment with the standard neurotypical parenting assessment. And when somebody's parenting doesn't match that, it's like you've got a professional, they're going, well, you know, I've got this tool, this measure here, and according to this instrument, according to this process, this is inappropriate parenting, or it's different parenting, or it's wrong parenting, or something like that. You haven't fit what we're looking for. And it's the way that becomes not fitting equals bad, not fitting equals harmful. It's that kind of jump of logic that happens that doesn't have any evidence to underpin that, but seems to occur so often that there's this association between difference equals bad, traumatizing, damaging, wrong, needs to be fixed. And it's a terribly kind of discriminatory approach, whether it's intended or not. And it's a very kind of normative approach, isn't it? It's like you have to fit everybody else. You have to fit the neurotypical general population. If you don't fit that, then there are going to be problems. And that's something, you know, more broadly that myself and my colleagues are working really hard to try and change, not just around FII, but just generally speaking in terms of the way in which different neurotypes are not seen as being, you know, better or worse than each other, but actually there's just difference. And that difference doesn't equal bad, because this is something that you know seems to come up quite a lot, and I think that partly is underpinning all of this. It goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think that the fact that so many of the cases that I've been aware of around FII are not under the guise of actually poisoning the child. They're all under this emotional abuse umbrella, which is so subjective, and so often it's an assumption of emotional abuse by people who are neurotypical professionals looking at a neurodivergent family and going, you're different, that's got to be bad. It's that jump that's happening, and therefore it must be harmful to the child because you're not being the kind of parent we think you should be. And that's what we really need to change. And FII as a construct at the moment, unfortunately, feeds into that thinking instead of challenging that thinking. So it's part of kind of a bigger picture, I think.
And I think, you know, there are times as well when parents don't realise they're neurodivergent, and professionals don't realise that the parent's neurodivergent. And I also think that, you know, that bodes another area of training that needs to happen. So yeah.
We always say as well at Sunshine, we can still safeguard children by being curious rather than judgmental. It's that old Walt Whitman quote of be curious, not judgmental. And so many professionals have said to us, but it's important for us to safeguard the children. But I keep saying you can still safeguard children by being curious and not making that jump, to a judgment. And Cathie, as a social worker, I've got a bit of a question for you, and there may not be an answer, but when we look at psychology and we know that whatever we're exposed to, we're likely to see in the things that are forthcoming in our life. Okay, so by that I mean social workers who are based in a child protection team must see some dreadful things. They must see some dreadful cases of abuse, neglect, genuine genuinely dreadful, awful situations, and they're brought into them and they are expected to deal with them with almost no emotion, and they have to jump, I guess, to a judgment in order to keep children safe because they're very extreme situations. When they're then presented with a case like many of the cases we're talking about today, an FII case, do you think that because they've been exposed to these dreadful things, that they make an automatic assumption, because that's just how brains work, that it must be another case of abuse? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And in a way, I think, yes, in some cases that will happen. That it's just seen as another, if it's come through and it's been accepted, it's another case of abuse. However, I would challenge the premise that even if that is happening, as you say, there needs to be curiosity, there needs to be sort of having an open mind, looking at all the evidence, not jumping to an automatic conclusion, but looking at all the evidence, weighing it up to arrive at a decision about what's happening, and whether there needs to be a Section 47 assessment or not, all of that. So, but I do think that our own experiences professionally, and I speak for myself, and will influence how we see things, how we experience what's put before us. And so that, and I've just written about this actually for a chapter of a book about the importance of reflective supervision. So in supervision, looking at what's my stuff, my life baggage, my life experiences, my script, etc., and what is going on with the people I'm working with. So being able, and I think there's being fair to, I'm not here to attack social workers in any way. But it is about, there is a lack of, on the whole, good supervision for social workers to be able to do that. And because of the pressures, it's more about, and this is my own experience in a local authority, so have you got your case notes up to date? How many cases have you closed? That sort of thing, rather than, okay, what's going on for you at the moment, how you're feeling, what you're struggling with, etc. So,
Yeah,
because
so
again, it's perceived as not coping.
So they're actually providing a more operational KPI-based supervision rather than a therapeutic supervision, which is what is needed. Because let's be fair, all these professionals, teachers, social workers, the medics, they are seeing some extreme cases from day to day. And so, like you said, this is not about bashing anyone. This is, we know that education, health and care is completely underfunded. And along with that underfunding comes, lack of education in terms of keeping up with the science. We talk about that all the time. But it's absolutely heartbreaking to see that there is just not enough support, education, supervision. This is what's missing. This is where a lot of the issue lies, actually. But yeah, sorry, I went off in a different direction then, but it's something that I often think about. So I thought, well, I'll come to the best and ask you.
Well, I think no, it's really, really, it's so valid, and I think if that's something I would love to see changed in sort of for social workers' experiences wherever they work, is having good quality, high caliber supervision, where they can just go and take whatever they need to take without the fear of being told, if I say this, I'm going to be deemed as not coping, or I'm going to end up, being on a disciplinary or something. So, that kind of thing. Okay. So I'm just going to go on to, before we come to questions, how parents of medically complex children can manage difficult situations. And I take that term from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. So choose your doctor wisely, do your research and trust your instincts. So if you need, and I know on the NHS you cannot always choose your doctor, what it's saying there is doctors aren't always right. It's okay to question, to challenge, even. However, there can be consequences, but trust your instincts as a parent. Keep communication with professionals clear and succinct. And I think sometimes it's a bit sort of if we give all the information and it sort of bare our souls in some ways, it's really hard to take that back. And what is done with it? How's that used? How's that interpreted? Or how's that misinterpreted? So it's thinking about that sort of. And I will always say that if any family are involved with children's social care in relation to FII or any dispute, you have to work with them. You can't just shut the door and say, go away, don't come in. It will make things so much worse. So on that basis, just keep very clear, succinct communication and try and keep the emotion out of it. And I know I'm not saying emotion's not important, but it is actually, just try to keep that out. Don't use medical terms, because that's where parents are accused of FII, because they know all the medical terms. So Dr. Google, that they've been looking this up and they know this and this. But actually, a lot of parents accused of FII, and I think if this were researched, it would come out statistically, are professionals. They are very capable, competent professional people, competent professional women. So don't use medical terms. And describe the symptoms and ask about procedures. So don't say, oh, this is my child's so-and-so or so-and-so. Describe what they're presenting, what you see, and ask about procedures. So rather than sort of presenting that you know everything. And this has also come up quite a few times, modify social media posts, because professionals will look at somebody's social media posts. And I have worked with people where parents have been challenged about what they put on social media. So it's really important to be careful, because once it's out there, it's public. And make a plan, especially if your child has a complex medical condition. And it's also just thinking about the future, is thinking about who else can be involved to make decisions when your child reaches adulthood. And I have sort of 4 children, 2 of whom are neurodivergent, and it's thinking about, what do I do when I'm no longer here? What support are they going to need? And then also providing evidence to support your child's difficulties, such as the general practitioner, child and adolescent mental health services, and specialist consultants. However, the flip side of that is when parents have provided the evidence, it's not been taken notice of. So these aren't sort of, you've got to do this. These are just sort of ideas. If I had a solution to FII and there was one thing you could do and it would all go away, then again, we wouldn't be here, or we'd be selling that. There isn't a quick fix. There is not. And that's what's so difficult about the whole situation. And engage good legal representation. You might be eligible for legal aid agency funding if there are child protection proceedings. But the legal aid agency funding has been cut back and cut back and cut back, which I find very difficult, because I believe everybody should have access to good legal support, whatever their means. And getting good legal representation is very costly. And then link up with other parents who are having or have had similar experiences, using resources like Facebook, local groups, national groups. There's a lot more going on in terms of support out there, parent carer networks, which are really au fait with the issues to do with FII. I also know as well that if a parent is at home caring for 1 or more children with difficulties, disabilities, it's really hard to have the time to be able to do these things. So, I'm not denying that. Really important, keep detailed and accurate records of all correspondence with the local authority, education, health agencies. So even if that's putting a note on your phone that, on a certain day, you made a phone, this time I telephoned CAMS or telephoned the doctor's surgery, keep a record of it, keep a record of all correspondence, print it off as well. Endeavour to work with the local authority, otherwise the situation could escalate. And I say this with caution because it can be a very traumatic experience for people, but using subject access requests under the general data protection regulations to get copies of records held by agencies. However, I would say that in doing this, it's get great information. You'll hopefully see what's going on behind the scenes, how decisions have been made, but it also can be very traumatic to read inaccurate information or assumptions that have been made about a parent or both parents or children. So I think it's, yes, ask for the information, but hopefully be in a good place when looking at it, or have somebody there with you to support you. I sort of say that as a health and safety check, really, to do that. Under GDPR, individuals have the right to access their personal data. Anything from a third party will usually be redacted. However, documents shouldn't be sent with the majority of the information redacted, because that's questionable. It's commonly referred to as subject access. You can make a subject access request verbally or in writing. I put it in writing though, because there is an evidence trail. And their agencies, individuals, organisations have 1 month to respond to a request, and they cannot charge a fee to deal with the request in most circumstances. There will be some where there can be a small administration fee. And this is what needs to change, and there's so much more. Safeguarding is absolutely essential. Protecting children from harm is vital. However, a clear understanding of a child's needs must be established. So looking at, what does this child need? And it isn't about diagnosis, because the Children Act is about assessing the needs of a child. Professionals must understand FII. It's not the same as Munchausen syndrome by proxy or factitious disorder imposed on another. It's not a diagnosis. Training on neurodivergence is needed to prevent children and their parents from being marginalised, excluded, and feeling victimised, rather than their differences being celebrated. And you know, that's the ethos of social care. It's meant to be about inclusivity, difference being celebrated, a person with a disability or difference being the expert of their own conditions. That's how I was trained as a social worker. I doubt that's changed, and yet that's not often the experiences that families have. And different approaches to parenting must be understood, with less emphasis on a neurotypical style being the only way. There are many different ways of parenting, and you know, no parent gets it all right. None of us do. And so it's about good enough parenting and what works with this family. And I'm just going to go to the last page, which you should get a copy of. This is the references, so that I've referred to. I'm going to stop sharing. I've got no idea what the time is, Krista, but oh, now I know. 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, we've got about 20 minutes. So we've not got too many questions, but we've got some interesting statements that I will read out. Caroline said there is a worrying overlap between perceived FII flags and some neurodivergent traits, which obviously we've covered quite a lot. But yes, she's absolutely right. Someone else has said that the clinician safeguarding guidance published by the RCN is also very concerning. Rachel Gavin said that the evidence of the RCPCH guidelines of peer, or there is no evidence, sorry, in the guidance or peer review. It's an absolute shambles. And then one lady has said, and well done to this lady, because she's actually protected herself with a fake name, so that's good. So she can't be tracked. I have studied a level 2 autism course to support my daughter. My daughter has PDA suspected, but the area that they're in won't state that it's PDA. She has several other comorbidities, so gives a perplexing presentation. She highly masks, so only shows or speaks her challenges at home and won't show any other professional. now mum is being accused of FII, of exaggerating her condition. This sounds very familiar to me. And in her ADOS assessment, so her autism assessment, it states demand avoidant and PDA. Also states I'm self-diagnosing PDA. Help. So she's actually going on the basis of a clinical report, but they're ignoring the report and just saying, it must be mum. So what should she do? And I don't know what professionals are involved because they described as just professionals. So any ideas?
Well, I know you said Rachel was watching. Hello, Rachel. But Rachel would say, because she's a very good advocate for this, go to the British Association of Social Workers Practice Guide and look at that and use that to talk to professionals about what's going on. Look at it, and because it is based on research. It's not something we've just sort of a whim put together. It's what we know and what we know is happening as a group of professionals to write that. So I think go to that, because lots of professionals won't be aware of that, even though there's lots are. So I would start with that, just to sort of and again, there are no quick solutions. There really aren't.
Sadly not.
It's so hard.
Ange says, hi, I haven't been accused of FII yet, but I'm concerned that it could happen. Due to getting absolutely no help and, of course, being neurodiverse myself, I've done everything I can over the last 18 months to learn everything about autism, ADHD, sensory processing, selective mutism, etc., and help my daughter as much as I can myself. I have done everything I can over the last 18 months. Is there anything that I can do to help prevent or prepare for an accusation?
I think it goes back to what I was saying in the last couple of slides about it's not sharing all that knowledge, it's not using medical terms, it's describing what you're seeing as a parent rather than saying this is sensory processing, this is this, this is that. So, and it's horrible to have to say that, because it's actually playing down knowledge and experience, but it can be misinterpreted.
It's very, very sad. And I think, like I said earlier, the more the system doesn't do for our children, the more, like Ange, we sort of sit up, upskill ourselves. We attend these webinars, we go to different parenting groups and sit with professionals and do all the right things. But it then leads, we start ticking boxes, don't we, on that checklist. So something else that came up in the chat was about the way that certain softwares that are being used in the NHS and the local authority are helping to code families. So in particular, there's two called EMIS and System 1. I've seen the System 1 on the screen somewhere, maybe the NHS. And that actually that can, because that coding is open to interpretation by the next clinician, it can almost push you into this area when it wasn't intended. Have you come across anything like that before?
Yeah, it's not something I've come across either, but I can understand how it might happen, for sure. I mean, I think whether it's through kind of IT systems and data systems, or whether it's just through the record keeping of different professionals. I think you touched on this earlier, Chrissa, when you were talking about people looking through the lens of their own experience. You will get professionals who look at notes and interpret it in a very different way to the way it might have originally been meant, in all different directions. I think I guess part of what we didn't talk about, but is also inherent within what we're discussing, is the need for better joined up practice between different organisations and different professionals, because our systems at the moment work in such a way that you've got you've got education, you've got social care, you've got health, and they're supposed to kind of join together, hence the EHCP kind of things, but they don't. They all kind of operate in their little bubbles and they don't communicate very well together. And exactly as we've just heard from Ange saying, you know, she's had an ADOS assessment that says, yeah, demand avoidance. But that professional working in health or psychology is not necessarily talking to the professionals that are in education or social care, who won't know who that person is, and may never read that report, or if they do read that report, not know how to understand it anyway, not necessarily paying attention to it. So the fact that we have all of these little pockets of professionals, I don't think is very helpful. Our systems as a whole could really do with an overhaul, so that we're much more collaborative working professionally and much more communicative professionally, instead of having kind of lots of different individual groups. I mean, and it goes back to what you were saying, Cathie, about part of the issues on the FII checklist is, you know, going to see multiple professionals and taking your child to multiple different people. But you kind of have to do that because the system is set up to make it impossible for you to get any support unless you bounce from pillar to post, going to see absolutely everyone you can possibly access for all of the different areas of things that you might be faced with. There's no sort of one-stop shop, is there? If you've got educational difficulties, then there's all of this list of people you need to go through for education. And I've worked with families where that, you know, and I'm sure you have, Cathie, where you've got concurrently running the social care child protection thing and the EHCP educational stuff happening at the same time. Both having different reports, both having different practices, not actually talking to each other at all. And you can have one come out with, this child definitely needs, you know, an EHCP and they need support in school, and then, but social care going, oh no, mum's making it all up. And you kind of go, what, you're in the same authority. Why are you guys not communicating with each other? And I think that's really frustrating.
But it's also as well, Fiona, it sort of brings up the point, and you know, it's a much bigger thing, that the education tribunal, you know, they don't link up with the family court. So somebody could be an educational tribunal, you know, getting the right, you know, the outcome is they get the right support for their child, and yet in the family court, you know, which can be running at the same time, they're seen as harming their child. So, you know, that needs to connect as well. And there's no reason why it shouldn't happen, because the Working Together to Safeguard Children 2023 guidance says everyone should be working together to safeguard children.
Yeah. And it does seem to be, when you get into those courts and tribunals, it seems to be an enormous battle of ego as well. And I remember sitting there in one of my tribunals, and Cathie was alongside me, where a local authority social worker tried to sort of poo-poo anything that Cathie said. It was so totally unprofessional, but it creates another layer of animosity that just isn't necessary. It's already difficult being in that room without having somebody who's wanting to have a bit of an ego off with someone else in the room. Really frustrating. So this is something else that comes up a lot in FII. We're seeing a lot of the connection is long COVID and PANS pandas, which I know you've written the guidance for PANS pandas as well, which I've put the link to actually in the chat already. But this particular lady said that her children's long COVID turned into PANS pandas, which were pandas, is what she's saying. This lady is autistic and she's upset the doctors through the process. 2 years on, she's only allowed to now see her boys one each per week for 2 hours. And it's just heartbreaking. There's actual clinical diagnoses there. It's heartbreaking. And I don't suppose we have it. There's no particular question there, but I think there are so many people. I know there were some comments this morning when people said, well, you know, it's never happened to me. I've never had anybody try and blame me, but if they did, they'd know about it. And I thought, no, the harder you actually fight back, the more of a target you become as a parent. So, you know, it's not a case of I've got a better personality or more education or more money or I've got a strong, you know, character. Nothing to that. They don't care about any of that.
It doesn't make any, it really doesn't make any difference. Yeah, it's and you know, it's the other thing as well, is that, you know, it's very hard, and there's so much more being sort of talked about, like here this week and publicly, about FII. It's very hard for parents to have children removed from their care without their neighbours or local community thinking there's no smoke without fire, they've got to have done something, and it's that shame and guilt and embarrassment and not being able to talk about what's happened openly, with people accepting and understanding, actually we've got a system that's not working at the moment.
Absolutely.
Or the system, there's lots of systems that aren't working, they're not working individually and they're not working together.
Yeah, it's absolutely archaic, and I think again it's that following science. Science has given us so much development in our knowledge, but the systems are just not keeping up with it. So it's very, very disjointed. So I'll come to another question. Jane says, social workers are not SEN trained. I supported a mum through a case with a written letter. Her son was diagnosed autistic, but eventually the mum was being blamed. Oh, sorry, her son was diagnosed as autistic eventually, but the mum was being blamed for his condition. She almost lost all of her children because she was misunderstood. We see this a lot, don't we? And it is that lack of SEN training, because we see so many, not just social workers, any professional really, who will say, I'm an autism champion. And when you challenge that and you say, what makes you an autism champion? They'll say, I did a 3-hour course. And it's that sort of, oh, a 3-hour course. You're not even scratching the surface with a 3-hour course, because what you're probably being trained in is things like they probably won't make eye contact. This particular breed of human might not have empathy, and it's just nonsense. It's like archaic stuff that, excuse me. There's a lot of talk as well about the money situation, and the fact that it seems to be one, like I mentioned earlier, but there was a lot of chatter afterwards about one department saving money by passing the problem family on to another department. And as much as we try and stay open-minded about this, it does all always seems to point back to this. And also this particular lady says that schools seem to have a lot of power in alleging that families are presenting with FII, even when medical professionals are saying no. We had a case just recently where the mental health team, CAMS, had signed the child off from school because the child was medically unfit to attend school. And the head teacher was very much, well, who do you think you are doing that? And this was a clinical psychologist. So they were absolutely qualified in doing that. But the head teacher kept turning up to the house and proceeding to try and get into the house to see if the child was okay under the guise of safeguarding. And it's like, actually, you're putting the child at more risk, because actually, if anybody tried to get into my safe space, I mean, as an adult, they know about it, but as a child, you feel totally so vulnerable and powerless. And as a parent, you're thinking, am I now going to be sent to social care because I didn't let the teacher into my house? Am I allowed to tell them not to come into my house? You're sort of bordering into like bailiff territory. It's quite very invasive. Okay, so another question. If accused of FII, should you seek further reports to prove suspected thoughts? For instance, being diagnosed as autism but shows all traits of PDA. So like that further diagnosis to try and prove the PDA. It's tricky.
Right, okay, I was going to say, from my experience, I can't say yes or no, because I have worked with families where they've had brilliant experts, really great, some of who are involved with Sunshine, and yet they're not listened to. Their reports aren't read, they're not listened to in the family court. It's not there, or they're not allowed to give evidence or not invited to give evidence. So it's really difficult. So what I don't want to do is advocate that people spend a lot of money and getting extra assessments where it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. It's so difficult, and I think this is why Fiona, Sunshine, lots and lots of other professionals are really working very hard behind the scenes to try and get things changed, nationally, because it's just, there isn't any, the system and systems have got to change, because there isn't a right or wrong way. I cannot say to a parent, okay, you do this, this and this and you'll get out of FII, because it might not happen.
No.
No.
I mean, I think in terms of getting additional assessments, if it's gone down the FII route, then go through the solicitor. So the solicitor asks for it to be a court-ordered assessment, because if the assessment is ordered by the court, then it will be listened to, it will be heard in court. It won't be seen as you as a parent or a family sort of going into, doing more things that potentially could be twisted against you. So it's always better to have it kind of, I guess, required by or requested by the judge. I mean, that's part of the problem. Listening to some of the things that have been talked about, I think, is the fact that because it goes down the child protection route, it goes into the family law system, and the family law system is a very strange system. It's a very closed book, and it's very adversarial. It's a very unpleasant environment to be in. It's one of the reasons that I don't do expert witness work anymore, because, Cathie was talking about, you were talking, Chris, about Cathie being challenged in educational tribunal. I mean, I've been had barristers from the local authority perspective doing their damnedest to tear my professionalism into shreds in the most vicious way, in an attempt to have my expertise dismissed by the courts. And it's not a pleasant thing to be in. And I think until that system changes as well, and it's not an adversarial us and them kind of battle that's going on, but it's actually collaborative working for the benefit and the sake of the family and the child, then we are going to continue to have these sort of situations. So I think quite a lot of what we've been talking about this morning, you've got two things going on. You've got FII as a construct not being evidence-based, not being very clear, not being well defined. And the ramifications of that is what happens when that then falls into this broken system of ours being used in inappropriate ways and just snowballs out of hand. So part of what Cathie and I and Luke and people are trying to do is challenge FII as a construct, but it's not just about that. It's because it's feeding into this kind of broken system and it's the system, it's the way some local authorities are kind of then interpreting that, and some professionals are interpreting that and erroneously scooping up all of these families. So there's kind of two sides to it, I think, that need challenging.
And for the families who perhaps can't afford solicitors or advocates, there's a question here. At what point do you go to an MP or a councillor when the local authority are getting this very wrong?
I guess I would say go to them at any point, actually. They're there for you. And the more MPs that hear about it. In fact, there is, at the moment, I've got it, any of you following me on Twitter, the House of Commons have currently got a survey going that's asking about families' experience of social care system. So anybody wants to have their voice heard, there's actually right now a survey by the House of Commons asking for families to talk about their experience of the system. So things are sort of slowly happening. MPs, I know of some MPs, I can't name them, but I'm aware of MPs who are interested in this, who are supporting trying to change this. It is slowly trickling out there, and I think it's picked up momentum because there are now more professionals and parents working together and more voices being heard consistently saying the same thing, coming from multiple different disciplines. So it's not just social work, it's not just psychology. I mean, Luke's in law, you've got Andy who's in sort of social policy. So you've got professionals from multiple disciplines going, this is not working, and supporting the parent voice. And it is making people listen. It's just that the wheels turn slowly, but we're getting there.
We are. So one more thing. It's more an opinion, I think, that this person's looking for. She was saying that it's interesting that in her area, it's therapies services or CAMS who seem to make a lot of the FII narrative. In speaking with them, they claim safeguarding is our bread and butter, which, when you think about that statement, is fundamentally the wrong lens.
Mm.
And I think that
Yeah.
nail on the head, doesn't it, really? But yeah, it's been a very, very informative chat, and I'm sure everybody agrees because the chat's been going quite quickly, and we've had a lot of viewpoints and a lot of stories being shared with us. But I always learn something new, and it refreshes my mind as well, because it's an area that I don't like reading up on. Because, when you've been traumatized by it, you're like, I want to help and I will help, but I will do my learning each May when we sit down for FII Awareness Week. But in terms of what we've got lined up this week, there's quite a lot. This afternoon at 1 o'clock, we've got a webinar with me talking about school avoidance and the links between school avoidance and FII, because we know that the minute a child is supposedly missing from the education system, then we get these safeguarding allegations and things can be whipped up quite quickly. And another one that I'm really interested in, so I'm going to be attending this as an attendee tonight, is at 8 o'clock tonight, we're going to be talking about Gestalt language processing, because we know that Gestalt language processors learn language in a different way, and that can land us as parents in quite a lot of trouble, which it's never intended by the child whatsoever, because they don't actually understand what they're saying, but it can actually land the parents in quite a lot of trouble. So we've got Libby Hill's one of her sidekicks, Dawn, she's going to be doing a webinar on that at 8 o'clock tonight. And we mentioned today as well, I won't go through the entire lineup for the week, but we mentioned today about having that support network that's accessible. So on 8 o'clock, God, it's that time of the day. I need another coffee. On Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we have an online cuppa and chat that's dedicated to FII. So if anybody wants to come along, you can dip in and out. It's for 2 hours. You don't have to be there for the entire 2 hours. You can come along to that and have a chat to us, and know that you're not alone, because I think that's the biggest thing, isn't it, for parents, is knowing that they're not alone. They're not the only ones, sadly. Quite often it's not actually personal, but it certainly feels like it is.
Yeah, and it can be very personal, and I think it is a very lonely place to be for parents when they're going through battling to try and get the right support for their child or to be heard. Really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. But I hope it feels a little less lonely for everybody this morning anyway. So thank you both so much. It's an absolute delight to sort of listen to you and learn from you. And if anybody has any questions, be sure to ping us a message and we'll absolutely help. But ladies, thank you very, very much. Hopefully I'll see you before next year's event.
Yeah,
But have a lovely day anyway. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
thank you.
Peter.
Bye bye. Thank you both.
Bye.